Good morning. This is Mark Engel from AMC. Hopefully you're in the right window here with the Board Member Recruitment and Selection and Trade and Professional Associations research. It's been conducted through the ASAE Foundation, spearheaded by Sharon Moss and her wonderful research team at the foundation, and also guided very heavily by a wonderful ASAE research committee. I think Mark Beebe was the chair at the time, maybe Hannes Combast is today. I know Mona Buckley and the whole team involved in this research has been very engaged throughout this almost two-year process.
2 years.
I feel like I've earned another doctorate here in going through this research. This is Mark Engel from AMC. Start off with a little bit of a disappointment. My colleague Will Brown out of Texas A&M is bedside with a family member who has had a health challenge this weekend. So he'll be listening to the call later on and issuing technical corrections for anything that I may have misdiagnosed or shared with you. So I'm sorry that Will is not able to join us. And he had a team of 4 at Texas A&M who were very actively engaged in the research, both on the quantitative side and the qualitative side, literature search. So it's disappointing not to have him on here, but he and I have been actively working this research together for, again, nearly 2 years. In fact, last night we put hopefully the finishing touches on the final report, which is actually version 13 today, so lucky number 13. Also with me is Peggy Fergus, who's been instrumental in our office. There have been 6 other colleagues at AMC who've been engaged in this research too. So this took a village to produce this research. But before we get started too, we're going to try and use the chat side for questions. So hopefully you've got the capacity to send in your questions through chat, and Peggy's going to manage that while I try and talk through the research here. We have a lot of material for 60 minutes, so we're going to plow through a lot of it, and then hopefully we'll be able to engage in the Q&A with you in a robust way. So let's get going here. Okay, so what we set out to do, our research questions were pretty simple. What practices are utilized to select board members? How prevalent are they? And then what practices actually account for better board performance? So the aim of the research is really to help association executives and leaders refine or modify recruitment and selection practices that support optimal board performance. So that's where we're going. How do we get there? How do we do it? 3 elements to the methodology in this study. First of all, actually, was the literature search. We searched current research on both processes in board member identification and cultivation and recruitment, and then also competencies that are out there in available research. So that was the first leg of the study. That led to our qualitative approach, in which we had the case studies, which really validated the steps in the nomination and identified some cross-cutting themes, and we'll get into the 8 cross-cutting themes in a few slides here. That's the meat of the research. But we validated the research through a quantitative tool. I think we had 340 responses. We'll show you what that looks like. That was primarily of association CEOs. So this was a multi-method research program that was many years in the making. So let's get into the qualitative results first here. After the literature search, again on processes and competencies, we honed in on what were the practices utilized to select board members. We had 16 case studies. We identified leading practices in organizations through a variety of means. So I think we vetted over 35 associations and settled on 16 to research what we considered to be exemplar association practices, and then there were 5 that we dove really deep into, and then 11 that we picked off certain elements that were interesting or unusual that had impact on research on the methodology of selecting high-performing boards. We did validate this 18-step nomination process. Highly unlikely that any organization went through all 18 steps, but they were manifest throughout the research, and so we did include them. So if you do have a lot of spare time on your hands and over-engaged volunteers, you could go through all 18 steps and comprise a high-performing board if you do everything that they suggest. Of course, I'm being facetious. Okay, so let's get to a little bit about the methodology, and this is the quantitative survey. Again, we had 342 responses of association executives. They described the current nomination process in their association, and that provided information on respondent background, their nominating committee composition, nominating practices and procedures, and the performance measures for the board and association. So what excited me about this research personally, as a practitioner for so many years in this space, and then a researcher too recently, was we aim to anchor this research against board performance, both on an individual board member basis and the collective board performance. And we were able to validate some of these key measures through the quantitative research. So to me, that was exciting. We set it up in the qualitative, the case studies, and validated much of it in the quantitative too. So it was pretty powerful how that came about. And you'll see that as we get closer through the slides. We're going to just spend a brief second or two on this. It's not that it's that complex, but we'll unpack it in a different way. 3 phases to the process of the board composition process. First is identifying the needs, and you'll see that in phase 1, which starts with appointing the committee and working through the competencies, confirming available seats, and so on. Again, we're going to unpack this as we go. Secondly is the whole element around recruitment. How do we identify, cultivate, and recruit future leadership? And then the third element is, so if we've identified these folks, how do we select them? How do we prioritize them? How do we vet them to make sure we're composing a high-performing board? Those, in essence, are the 3 elements, the model that we uncovered through this. Those steps that are unpacked in 1, 2, and 3 on the right side, you'll see manifest in a different process chart that we'll get to in a few minutes. But they do line up with this next 2.5 slides, if you will. This table really unpacks all of those 18 steps, and it talks about who does what as the facilitators, and then more of a description of these steps. Now, this is not meant to be a public document. What this is meant to do is guide those in the nominating committee and the staff in how we're going to go about doing things and who's going to be doing these things through the process. So this is a good internal diagram and responsibility, accountability chart, if you will. But again, I would not recommend sharing this with your members through the website and what have you. It's too complex for them. We'll show you a better tool that we've comprised for that in a few slides. So this is the second part of it, going through the 13 steps and jumping to 18. What you're missing between 13 and 18, frankly, is here. Not that this is complex at all. Being very facetious today, aren't I, Peggy? This chart is really the steps 14 through 18. This is the election methodology. So it was really pretty interesting. We unpacked it in three segments. The first segment, got to put my glasses on to read this micro print, is around the board capacity to make decisions, and that's A, which is the left side of this diagram. The right side is the membership body, which could be your membership at large, or it could be a segment, whether it's a House of Delegates or some body, if you will, that is charged with the authority for the election process. And then the third one, which is the center column, which is where the nominating committee has the authority. This one talks about authority. Who's got the authority to make what decision? So on the left side of this diagram, and I do realize this looks complex, I'm going to try and keep it simple though. So the nominating committee is going to make their recommendation, and it's going to come before the board. Again, this is the left side of the diagram. It's numbers 14A, 15A, and so on the left side. Where the nominating committee makes a presentation to the board either accepts that slate or they vet it. And if they vet it, do they have the capacity to accept it? Do they have the authority to anoint the board at that point? Or does it go to the public process back to the membership or that House of Delegates or Council of Delegates for a more of a formal voting mechanism? That's where you see that dotted line shoot to the right side, the B side of the diagram, where again, the nominating committee or the board has vetted the candidates, they're presented, and then 15B1 is where there's either contested or competitive elections and that are non-competitive, and yet there often is a petition process. So in other words, if there's an uncontested or non-competitive slate that's presented, oftentimes the members have the capacity to petition and say, we don't like what you did, or we want to add somebody else. So that's what you'll see there is 16. and then it results in a balloting process. And then there's a third channel within this, which is sometimes of a hybrid model, where some are competitive, some are non-competitive seats within the same slate, if you will. Again, that would result in a ballot. So the election methodology is broken out in this chart through our research. Okay, here's the fun one. So, and this particularly arose in our, arose through our case studies, the 16 organizations we dove in deep with. So this is going to be the bulk of the presentation here. 8 themes. You'll see on the top we start with role and structure of the nominating committee. Then we get into the process, which we unpacked a lot of that already, but we have some different angles on that. And then board competencies, the element of diversity and balance, the composition element around the board, the evaluation and selection process, again, back to the election methodology, the gray box to the left, and then the role of the CEO and staff. So those are the themes that we came through with, and we're going to unpack those here and now.
I'm up here.
Okay, so the structure of the nominating committee was pretty interesting. One of the elements that really emerged was how do you comprise the nominating committee, and it ranged in the gamut from accidental to very thoughtful. In fact, job descriptions and vetting material, vetting mechanism for who is comprised in the nominating committee. It surprised me how many people say this is a point of entry into leadership on the nominating committee, when some of the higher performing structures that we were examining really talked about actually vetting the candidates for the nominating committee. One of the key elements that came through was a balance of basically 3 board members that were elected by the board, if you will, and 3 public members elected by the membership to the nominating committee, and then chaired generally by the immediate past president or past chair of the organization. So that balance of 3 and 3 plus the tipping balance towards known leadership, if you will, in the room. So we saw some models that were 2 plus 2 plus 1, and some that were 3 plus 3 plus 1. So, but the average nominating committee size was around 5 or 7 that we found. And it depends on the size and complexity of the organization. So the other thing that really impressed us was the whole emerging element around leadership development instead of nominating committee. And what we found in the case studies was this evolution towards not a one-and-done approach of nomination committee. We need to populate a board, find them, vet them, and elect them. Instead of how do we identify avenues for people to get into leadership, to share information of what those leadership channels look like, what skill set that you need, how can we help develop you through the association in your leadership skills that will impact you personally, professionally, and for the association. So that evolution around leadership development has really taken off in a very serious way in some of these higher performing organizations. Another element is what authority the committee holds. And if you remember back to that complex slide on the election methodology, is the nominating committee making recommendations? Are they providing a slate? Do they have the authority to anoint board members, or are they really a vetting tool or a recruitment tool? So what authority do they have, and what vetting mechanism do they use? So the interesting thing about this nominating committee, and we did study a couple of organizations that frankly had a great mystery through their process. They couldn't even identify through staff and volunteer leadership the process engage members and to vet members. So basically it was a mystery of who is elected to what position and why. So cloaked in secrecy. So we unpacked that in our case studies in the final report. So demystifying the process was really a powerful element within this whole nomination committee structure and responsibility. What do they do? Which leads us to another exciting chart here, and I'm sure everybody can read this. We're not going to walk through every step of it. The context here is the more information that we can share with the membership, that there's a validated, consistent process, and they can identify how and when they get in the system and how and what is communicated to whom. That is a tremendous element of transparency. So this is the one where we are suggesting that people adapt a model such as this and share it through their website for their members and communicate it to potential candidates. So it's fairly comprehensive. Again, we don't expect people to go through every one of these steps. In fact, these are consistent with the earlier diagrams that we had. Remember the facilitator and the steps involved in the earlier two slides that came together. So this is consistent with that, but we think this is a better communication tool that outlines the steps in the process and who's got what responsibility. So you can see it starts in the upper left corner with appointing, and we're really calling it the Leadership Committee or Leadership Development Committee instead of the Nominating Committee, and then focusing with the board on what competencies are needed in the board and the representation with a small r. We'll unpack that in the near future here. What kind of balance and representation do we need on the board? And then it does walk through about having a candidate form. So the application form has taken on some new meaning in our context, asking the same information, the same types of questions and so on throughout the process. And then confirming, the bottom blue on the left side is a very interesting one. Confirm available seats and if potential re-election of current members. This is another aha through the process. It seems like no longer high-performing boards are assuming that you should be re-anointed to the board if your term is expiring and you still have the capacity to be re-elected. That it's going through a vetting process to reappoint directors or re-elect directors and not assume that just because you've been there for 2 or 3 years, you got another term coming. So some of the high-performing boards really did that well. We're going to walk through in a few slides the matrix that they used to evaluate it. But it was interesting that it's no longer a slam dunk that if you've been on the board, you're coming back. And then you can see, we'll go through the other steps through additional slides here, but it talks about obtaining leadership team input, the matrix for scoring and evaluating candidates, interviews, prioritizing the petition process. So again, to me, this is a great mechanism that we can use to share with our membership the process. Where they can get engaged, what that looks like, where the steps are. Great communication tool of demystifying, improving transparency. So that second bubble that we talked about, this is the third bubble. I should keep my slide here, I'm sorry. Is around competency. This is the third bubble now. What are the competencies that we're looking for? So this started with a literature review, and Will and the team did a great job of diving in. What is the research out there about nonprofit boards, and what are the skill sets that we're looking for? So the research really vetted down over 40 different competencies and skills and consolidated into primarily these 5 buckets, which we like to say is some of the hard skills and soft skills, and then also the competencies needed to drive strategy for the organization. And so what we discovered with some of these higher performing organizations in their nominating process is the more time they spent on the competencies and developing and articulating these clearly, the more candidates could review what your needs are and say, my skill set aligns with it or it does not. And so it allowed candidates to self-vet based on the diligence and the clarity you provide through this competency assessment. So taking serious stock of what these competencies look like is meaningful time. So you'll see they're broken into group skills, obviously team orientation. These are some of the soft skills, interpersonal skills. The personal skills, are they strategic? Are they innovative? What does that look like? And we'll see through the matrix how we unpack strategy further. The technical skills of the field and the organization, what are the experience and expertise and so on, integrity, commitment, and capacity. So we unpack in the report and really define these, frankly, and draw you back to literature if you want to go deeper on some of these. But the more time that you're going to spend identifying the competencies that you are seeking in your leadership, the higher the return of the investment is. And that is actually vetted out well in the quantitative study. We'll hit that near the end. So again, we found out there was a lack of unified terms. People used different terms and they didn't have clarification around it. By the way, one of the slides we're going to show you is all these samples we have at the end, and particularly a couple of organizations vetted these competencies in an incredibly detailed and clarifying way. These are going to be tools that will be available in the report that you could go and search and say, yes, this one fits us, or we need to tweak it. So the samples at the end of the document, to me, are going to be very powerful. This is yet one example of that. So So how are the competencies and skills? They're reviewed annually because your strategies change, and the gaps in current board makeup and needs, need to be identified. So, and then how do we track that and assess that? Those are the key elements that go with the research. Bottom line is deeper clarity equals better vetting and allows the committee to vet well. So diversity, to me, really boils for whether it's demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, and so on, size of membership, particularly some of the trade associations had representation based on corporate membership size or different categories, demographics within the organization, and so on. The other element that was loud and clear, and this came through one of our interviews, somebody with a membership of around 40,000 professionals, highly trained professionals, and they said, we have an emerging area in our practice, and yet we cannot populate the board with somebody who's representing that emerging area. And their problem was they have a competitive election process, and since no one could identify, or a small minority of the membership could identify with that emerging area, they would never get elected to the board. So when you take a look at that middle bullet and the populations that they do serve or want to serve, those are the things that we need to reflect in some of this diversity and balance issue. So how do you preserve that diversity? And it was noted in the quantitative study that it is difficult to achieve diversity, whether it's because of a competitive election process, whether it's identifying some of this diversity and balance through geographical areas, particularly those who are engaging in global development, international representation. How do you identify the people who could qualify for the skills and competencies that you're looking for in a representative way? Very difficult to do that. There are some different theories, and we unpacked a few of them in our case studies. So, okay.
Mark, if I could just jump in and encourage anyone who has questions as we go along to go ahead and chat them to me. We may not get to them for a little bit, but I'll have them queued up and ready to go.
Thank you, Peggy. Okay. Board composition, the overall makeup of the board, and that's the skill set and balance and so on, considers competencies and the characteristics of those board members, and identifying the current needs for recruitment. So what's that composition going to look like? And what is the skills gap? We'll spend a few minutes on the evaluation matrix, which is really going to help us dive deeper into that, which does allow us to get into the evaluation and selection tool. So this is kind of an overview. It was exciting to see some of the level of sophistication that is being used out there. One of the groups that we interviewed had a budget of $1.4 billion. That's a B word, $1.4 billion, large, complex organization. And what did they do, and how did they systematize their board selection process? In the beginning, they had hardly any applicants for the board seats because it was a mystery of what the process looked like. So they focused their attention on that process. And then they, voila, had over 600 applicants for the board and had a nightmare in managing that. So they realized that they had to focus deeply on their competencies, skills, and representation or balance that they were looking at for the board. And they systematized that. That wasn't the only organization. One of the organizations we went in deep with had a budget of slightly under $10 million. That was also very systematic in the evaluation of candidates and looking at representation with the current board and the demographics and skills that they needed to populate that future board. So using those systematic evaluation tools has come to a new level. I think we had like 3 or 4 samples that are attached to what that looks like, and we're going to drill down on one in the next slide here. It also allowed them to assess soft and hard skills that came through the literature review and the competencies that were identified. So how to evaluate that. The applications, the call form, if you will, on the website took a new meaning in some of these high-performing organizations because they asked consistent and detailed questions for people to explain their competencies and relate them back to the organization. So it wasn't just a, do you have this? It was, show us an example of how you've used it and what does that look like. Many of these organizations are using an interview process, some of them actually face-to-face, not many, and then several through the phone vetting process. One of the higher performing practices we had was that they identified, 3 of the competencies they were looking at. One was in governance, one was around financial elements, one was around HR elements, and they broke the interview teams into strengths around those capacities. Having somebody who has done interviewing and managed people was a high competence on the nominating committee or leadership development committee as a function. Understanding how to interview is significant. We've actually seen a couple of boards that have brought in trainers on how to interview. We also saw, you'll see the next one, this large organization I was referring to earlier of $1.4 billion budget, they hired a professional recruitment firm. One, they wanted to identify and bring in candidates that might not even be current members into a board leadership capacity, but 2, they wanted the professionals to vet them to understand what those competencies were and how they were engaging in their professional life around those competencies. So a very interesting evaluation mechanism and use of a recruitment firm. Now, most of us don't have the capacity to do that, but it was pretty interesting. So the research identified, for instance, in those 18 steps earlier and some of the matrix and samples, what does a $1.4 billion organization, what mechanism and system do they have, and how can we learn from that and adapt what they are doing into our environment for our size and complexity of organizations. And then again, the evaluation really determines about one of the key variables is the nominating committee's authority. What do they have the authority to do? Are they vetting? Are they identifying? Or are they actually deciding? So, okay, here it is. One of the key aspects of this was creating this tool, and I have to say this is adapted from a couple of organizations. I don't expect you're going to be able to read it, but I'm going to identify. Can they see my cursor yet?
Yes.
So they can see the cursor?
Yeah.
Okay. So this upper right-hand corner really talks about the demographic snapshot. Again, this is adapted from a couple of organizations. Actually, yeah, good. Okay. So they were looking at composing the board, whether it's current directors, not including those who are going off the board, and looking for gaps in what they needed by 3 key areas. For this particular example, it was around employment status. You have full-time, part-time, or retired people in their positions, so they had a little bit of an understanding of what that balance looked like. They had the ethnicity, and they broke it down geographically, if you will. And then they had an age range that was important to them, and then, of course, gender. So those were the demographics that this organization looked to. So using this element of this chart and populating it with the different elements around the demographics, whether it's ethnicity or what have you, is a powerful tool to say, this is what we currently look like, and then we'll be able to identify the gaps in those demographics because through this systematic evaluation tool. So what happens at the top of the page here is the current board, and again, ones that are returning, if you will, have identified themselves and self-selected around the competencies that were identified for this organization. So these competencies here on the left side include strategies through their strategic plan or the strategic objectives that they've identified, as well as their knowledge and experience. So it's well populated around hard skills and experience and organizational strategy. So when you talk about developing your competencies, these are a lot of competencies that they have, but they were pertinent. And again, this is a fairly large, complex organization. So I would recommend most of us would streamline this, but we need to keep it clear enough to understand what competencies we're really looking for. So for instance, one of the organizations had a tremendous amount of mergers and acquisitions in their community. Having somebody who has been through that and understanding what the mechanisms are in M&A was an important competency that they identified in that left margin. The beauty of this, it allows you to populate this kind of on a blind basis. But again, if people self-select who your current leadership looks like, what their competencies are, you can identify the gaps. What are we looking for? And that helps us write our competencies and create our call forms, if you will, for the membership to self-select. Do I have those competencies or not? Do I have expertise in mergers and acquisitions or not? If you're looking for somebody with prior board experience or sophisticated management experience managing hundreds of people, if we can put those in these competencies, people will be better able to self-select, saying, I align with your strategies and I have these competencies. And you as an organization, you as a nominating committee, understand what the gaps are that you're trying to fill. And that drives us to the bottom part of this equation, where this is a listing of nominees that have gone through the system, some of the preliminary checks. And some of the preliminary checks, for instance, were very staff-driven. Are you a member? Have you attended or participated or contributed to the organization? So some of that preliminary vetting tool will allow you to get into the sequence of it. So if there's things to bounce people out with immediately, such as membership or participation or contribution, the more we make that known up front, the more people will self-select and say, I better up my game and participate before I even think about getting onto the board or not. So this tool here at the bottom allows us to identify these candidates that are in the system, and you can see that we made up a name here, and they were looking at some diversity and some career stage issues, geography, and then the source of, did they come through an open call, or were they nominated by somebody else, or was a recruiter involved? And then it gets into the competencies that we've identified as an organization and prioritized, some of the skill sets, and some of the soft skills, and it allowed a Likert rating system from their application and the VITA of determining what their skill set looked like. So in this essence, the nominating committee had 2 people review each of the candidates and rate them on the competencies, from a 1 to 5. So it turned a qualitative tool into a semi-quantitative tool, because you have to be able to prioritize the candidates. So this mechanism, and by the way, the more we can publish about this, and I don't recommend publishing the current directors, but certainly the competencies and how they will be evaluated, the more that we can share publicly with our members, the more open and transparent the process seems. It doesn't mean we share with them how they were rated or ranked, but it does mean here's the criteria, and we can say we had 30 to 50 candidates or whatever, and we had to rank them, and so it was a very objective process in going through. So again, one of the better tools that emerged through this research. Okay, and we did talk a little bit around the board election process. Who's got what authority to appoint or elect? Is it the board, the membership, or the nominating committee? How is it presented? Is there a slate, or is it individually confirmed? We did some unpacking of that, because there's many different hybrid formats of a slate or individually or collective competition and so on. And again, the elements around, is it competitive or non-competitive? I'm trying to look through my notes here to see what I'm missing here. Some of the elements around this competitive versus non-competitive slate, I think this is the best point to really get into it. This is a huge issue. In fact, Beth Gaisley's prior work on high-performing boards validated that over 50% of the elections, so a majority of the elections, are non-contested, non-competitive these days. And our research validated that as well, and you'll see some data in a few slides. So the majority, slight, but the majority are moving to a non-competitive election process. And in some of the research, one of the volunteers that we interviewed said, Mark, I'm a head of a major healthcare system, and for me to go on a competitive slate and to lose would be humiliating to our organization. I'm not going to subject myself to that. So how do you get around those types of issues? Winners and losers. In our interviews, again with the 16 case studies, time and time again it came up about winners and losers. Also about not being electable because of this company size or the strata or segment that they're in. If it's an emerging segment of the profession, most of the members can't relate to them. So how are they going to get elected? So that element, also the academician role, that people who are in professors, for instance, like Will Brown, he's out in the speaker circuit a lot. He has great name recognition, so they do win a lot of elections. And so we do hear often saying we need more practitioners and less academicians. So those are the elements that came around this whole competitive element. Doesn't mean the whole slate should be non-competitive. There are ways to approach it differently, but this is a huge issue for us. The other element that came up was the overall participation rate in elections. And I've been searching for data, because I keep seeing it was 7 to 10% of the members vote, whether it's e-ballot or mail ballot or whatever. I can't confirm that data, but and maybe somebody on the call can help us out with that. But my recollection is it's less than 10% vote in membership elections. Okay. Are you watching those? Are those questions or comments that are coming in?
There's some of both, mostly questions. You want to stop for one or two?
Sure.
All right. Well, Joel Albizo was wondering if, he's wondering what the plan is for distributing the research results.
Hey, Joel, that's a great question.
Okay.
And I know you've done a lot of research around governance, and you've been very helpful in guiding the study, too. We're going to actually have a call with Keith and Sharon, I think it's next week, to talk about what does this finally look like. Is it a book? Is it a session or what have you? We've written a final report, but we're not sure that that's going to be the final distribution. But we're already infusing a lot of this information, for instance, into exceptional boards and some of the other programs that we're working with. But we're going to have a strategy discussion on how do we distribute, because this is really pretty cool information.
Okay. Joel is also asking if, he says, was appointment identified or used as a way of increasing diversity and dynamism?
So appointment, so are we talking about slate versus
it was early on, yeah. I believe that is what he's referring to.
Yeah, so in the research we found out that if it was a competitive slate, getting that balance, getting that diversity was a real obstacle. In fact, you'll see a data slide how embarrassing our representation is in some of these ethnicity and geopolitical elements. So that was a major issue around board balance, was on the competitive slate. Some of them, one of the higher performing ones that we actually have in the case study, talked about a hybrid model where there are some competitive seats and some uncompetitive or non-competitive seats and appointments for diversity's sake. The other element that came up that was pretty interesting was a couple of organizations had the capacity to appoint directors after the process. So in ASAEs, one of the examples where they can go back and make 2 appointments, and if you look at their bylaws, they have the capacity to go back and make 2 appointments for a 1-year term because of some kind of a small r representative element that they were looking for. So that was an interesting practice that a couple of these organizations pursued. So, okay. Good questions, Joel. Okay, role of the CEO and staff. This is another area that was really very interesting in the research. It's not necessarily surprising, but I think convicting. And so this will be written up, hopefully in kind of a powerful way. You know, we can't underestimate the value of the staff in this process. Well, whether it is sticking to the process, having consistency to the process, having good communication consistency in the process, or the soft element of influencing anywhere from we're looking for this type of a skill set or this type of a representation in leadership to the harder element of this person shows up but they're not mentally there, they're not engaged or what have you. How does that look in the process, and how do we do that without offending or drawing scrutiny and challenging the credibility and integrity of the CEO? So that was an interesting element that came up in the research, and frankly I think we confronted it pretty well in some of the case studies particularly. So one element is supporting the process. Hopefully it's not too codified in the bylaws, but it is more in the policies and procedures of what is a process. And we have to remember, if we have a volunteer committee chair, we don't want it zigging and zagging every year. We want consistency in the process and the interpretation and understanding. We know that that's best handled through staff. That's what the research did come out and support too. And in a quantitative way, by the way. So managing the applications and the committee materials, which some of that's the upfront vetting and prioritizing. Being a facilitator of the process, and again, one of the higher performing organizations handled all communications with candidates through the staff person. So there was consistency and timeliness in communication, and there wasn't the undue pressure because, chair of the nominating committee or members of the nominating committee likely know several of these candidates. And so it released them of that burden of having to explain or qualify how things were going and consistency in messaging. And also the role of the CEO, identifying and encouraging prospective candidates. One of the key comments was from one of the CEOs saying, there is nothing I do that is more important than identifying and lining up future leadership of this organization. And also, I'm looking out 3 years for who's going to be that future board chair. So having that perspective from the CEO and the ability to contribute that in a hard and soft way is very compelling. The research supports that quantitatively, and certainly the case studies drill down on that further. Hope I'm keeping you all excited about reading the final report. And then providing insight into the candidate. I think I hit that enough. Okay, so let's focus on the quant a little bit here. Again, this is rural specialty, so it's, when we get into linear regression, I'm going to default to Peter O'Neill or somebody else to support that on the call. Just kidding you, Peter. Okay, so what did the survey look like? We had 342 valid responses, 11.5% response rate, which is pretty good, and mostly national, international organizations with a smattering of state and others. Most of the respondents were the CEOs. And in the position for 10 years or so. So this, we think, was a very good representative sample. We were delighted with the participation. Organization, most of them were over 25 years as an organization in practice. Good balance between professional and trade. I was actually a little surprised that the trade was as high as it was. And there was some divergence, and this is where Will would be really helpful. But there was some divergence in practices between trade and professional. I remember one or two specifically we'll get into, but the budget size, ranged for over 15 million, of course, but 1 to 5 million was the sweet spot in the responses. 1 to 5,000 members was also the sweet spot there. Female board members, 38%, so we're making progress on the gender balance, if you will, but we are terrible in ethnicity. And if you take a look at this, I mean, the mean of 1.53 for the African American community, and that's at a high note. Well, other than, of course, the white, the non-Hispanic at 85% is the primary makeup of the board. But so our ethnicity in the community, and I think we all knew this intuitively, but frankly is incredibly weak. And that came up, and you'll see that in the quantitative scores and how we're doing it, the different elements of the practice, of the process. Okay, so how are the candidates nominated? Not surprisingly, nominating committee and open call were significant. One that we're still at almost 10% are through chapters or regions. Interesting composing a board when you're really running it through the chapters and regions. I don't want to jump to that conclusion, but still the nomination process of almost 10% through chapters or regions is a little bit higher than I expected. And of course, most of us have a nominating committee, 77% basically. How are the elections conducted? And this is over 100% because you can use a couple different methodologies. Most vote electronically, some still voting face-to-face. The board elects the board members, 14%. And then a House of Delegates or General Assembly is almost 7%. So that kind of surprised me as well. Again, the competitive versus non-competitive is almost 50% for a non and 40% for competitive. Again, that pretty much supports Beth Gaisley's prior research on this. And then it gets a little bit of validating the process that we found. So just how we've rated this, it's a Likert of 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then for comparative purposes, we said, all right, let's combine the strongly agrees, if you will, and see where we are evaluating ourselves in this process. So perception of the process, and this again is in the eyes of the CEO, overall agreement with the following statements about your process. We're good at identifying prospective candidates. Maybe not so good. I would have expected quite a bit more than the third to say we can at least identify them. And vetting is slightly even worse. And then selecting we're a little bit stronger in. So a lot of room for improvement. And I guess not surprising intuitively, but statistically saying we're marginal, I guess I would say, at identifying, vetting, and frankly a little bit stronger than marginal in selecting candidates that are going to drive board performance. So the overall agreement about the process for selecting board members is clear and transparent. Not too bad, but again, even the ones that we interviewed that said they were pretty good at it said we'd still love to get better. And so that resulted in that beautiful bubble diagram, the process diagram that we showed you a little bit earlier. This was interesting. Number of applicants typically exceeds the number of seats to be filled. And I think if Will were on the call, he'd say this is where the trades and professionals diverged quite a bit. The trades were more heavily about saying the number of applicants equals the number of seats, whereas I think the professional societies tipped quite a bit the opposite, saying more applicants than number of open seats. So, improvements can be made to the thoroughness of the process. Yeah, mostly strongly agreed we could be better. So, interestingly, what's the level of difficulty in finding qualified candidates for the board? And Beth did some research on this as well. 44% said it's really pretty difficult to find quality candidates for the board. So I wish I had a longitudinal number on that, but interesting to see. We're still having a hard time identifying them. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the steps, and this is valid through the research. Just a couple things to focus on. This is about the board needs. We're good at ascertaining the competencies and skills for board members. Have a job description for board members. Again, there's going to be some nice samples in this report that you could drill down on what's a job description and the expectations, including time for board members. Assessing the needs of the board during the nomination process, looking at those competencies and so on. Almost 50%, but I think once you see and use the tools that were unveiled through this research, I think all of us will be able to up our game through that. The recruitment of prospective members, candidates submit applications, staff screening, which is really low, but we'll see that that's going to drive the quantitative results in a powerful way. So we should be doing a lot more of that, the research shows. Selection of board members, staff providing input. I'm going to skip through quickly of this one because we want to get to the performance measures here. So what did we learn, basically? And this is about individual board member performance. So the two elements that most impacted CEO's perception of individual board member performance were board members have the needed experience and background to be effective. So if we're not asking that up front and validating that through the evaluation mechanism, shame on us. And so board members have the needed experience and background to be effective is one of the biggest impactors of individual board performance. Second one was board members come to meetings well prepared. We all complain about that, but the research really showed about that as being a big problem for our community. So that's individual board member. Probably no big surprise to you, but it's nice to have the data to support it. And then the board performance, the overall board performance, the effectiveness of the board. So, and this is a compilation, we go to board source saying what are the roles, responsibilities of the board. We really come through the 4 buckets of oversight and time and strategy and allocating research and then succession and focusing on the CEO. So that's what we populated these items with, and we validated them through the research. Again, the same mechanism saying what did we think, who was very effective. Monitoring organizational performance, we think our boards are pretty good at that. Oversight, financial, even better. Time and strategy, boy, wouldn't we love to see that higher. And so there's definitely room for improvement on the board performance on that. And then providing guidance and support to the CEO, 51% there. So it's not that bad, if you will. And then understanding the board's roles and responsibilities, again, a lot of room for improvement on that. We're seeing a lot more interest in boards doing orientation and development, so that's a good news. They want to get better. Recruiting new board members were terrible. So that was a huge weakness in this research, saying we are really bad at that. And yet, the CEOs say it's the most important thing that we're doing. So we need to up our game. So thank you for this research, ASAE Foundation. Increasing the diversity of the board is even worse. And yet working together well is just, it drives organizational performance. We know that from other research, but it was well to see that validated here of 74%. So in a nutshell, that's what drives the performance. So I think this is the last key slide. So our last question was to the CEOs overall, how satisfied are you with the performance of your board? And this one kind of surprised me. 45% were extremely satisfied. Now, the big question is why were so many data points missing, 23%? And maybe they didn't trust us to hold the confidentiality of their individual results. That's too big of a number to disregard. I mean, that's probably 75 out of the 342, if you will. So that would be interesting if we could better dissect that. But okay, a couple of recommendations that come out of here. Regression results showed that there were a couple of keys that improved board member performance individually and collectively. Ascertaining the competencies and skills for the board members, spending time drilling down those competencies and looking for the gaps in the skills. Nothing more important than that. And then board performance is, executive staff providing input on the candidates and prospective candidates submitting an application for board positions. So that, when it says negative there, it's because of the differentiation between the trade and professional society responses. So, And then having prospective candidates submit applications for board positions, and the executive staff provides input on the candidates. I'm not sure why that was a repeat. Anyways. So, preliminary recommendations. I'm going to try and fly through this in 1 minute so we can get to your questions. But role and structure of the nominating committee. We talked a bit about the leadership development committee instead of nominating committee. We talked about the composition, the authority, the rigorous criteria to serve on the nominating committee, and we're going to have a sample that shows how a couple of high-performing organizations really focus on that skill set and competencies to even be on the nominating committee. So especially if you're electing them, they know what to look for and whether they should be in that loop or not. Around the process, detailed application with self-assessment, saying these are the skills we're looking for. Tell us your story. Why do you think you have them? A wide call for nominations, the level of transparency, and demystifying the process. One of our worst case studies, actually best case studies we learned from, was the total mystification of the process, and just it was no one could codify it. Again, the recruitment firm, consistency in the process, the competencies. I think we talked about diversity and balance. Again, not assuming renominations should get the head nod. The candidate evaluation, we talked about that. Interviews and background checks. One of the organizations said one of the things in our community is so important is financial integrity. So we do a D&B or something like that on the individual or companies to make sure that they have financial integrity. And police background checks and everything else. The election methodology. One of the interesting aspects that came up was the immediate past president serving as treasurer, and that's in one of our case studies. That fascinated me. The immediate past president has likely been through the channels, been on the board longer than most anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not a bad time, if you will, to have them serve as treasurer because they know about the needs and sources of financial and the priorities of the organization. I thought that was pretty interesting. I thought, that needs to be further examined. Keeping in context with your organization, of course. The wild card, a lot of, especially the professional societies, say you have to be on the board for 15 or 35 years before you can ascend to the throne. How do you truncate that longevity and put somebody into leadership without going through this longitudinal indentured servanthood to the board? That will be unpacked in one of the case studies. And again, the role of the CEO is really unpacked with input, the matrices, communication, and the long-term perspective. Okay, so if you're looking at the questions, just a couple of the sample documents that we'll have that are available. So some of the grids, the frameworks, the nominating committee selection criteria, sample call for nominations, volunteer evaluation process, some of the communication methodology. So we got all these wonderful leading practices and said, these are great samples for our community. Our intent or our hope is that they could be downloadable, so you could pull out the ABC Association and put in for Peter ASIS, for instance. So anyway, so that's where we're going with it. Okay, I'm done talking.
Okay.
You have a question?
I'm going to start with this one from Diana Schmidt because I think it will be a quick answer. She wants to know if we will be able to share the bubble diagram, Mark.
So I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
We think it's an important part of the research. When we can share it is the real question, not if, I think. Yeah. And we'll have to determine that next week. So,
okay.
Yeah, good question.
Okay. Then just a lot of really great things here. Larry Sloan has commented that on their board, everyone went through the Clifton Strengths Finder assessment.
Yeah.
And so as they look to the future, he said they're going to be interviewing candidates by thinking about the strengths that are not currently reflected in the group. Yeah. And it's kind of a forward-looking way instead of looking at their expertise.
Yeah. Hi, Larry. That is a wonderful gift, and we do see that in the leadership development process particularly, and that's not just for board candidates, it's for individual leadership development. And we have seen several boards. I'm trying to go back to the grid, the evaluation matrix, because to me, if you've got the capacity to use a tool like that, that helps you identify gaps, whether it's thought processes, leadership styles, or what have you. So using that in your gap analysis, I think, is an excellent tool to develop high-performing boards. You know, we know that sense of teamwork drives organizational performance. And the more things you can do, like what Larry's doing, and so on, the more you can advance that sense of team. So, and how do you evaluate it? Having it like that to help evaluate it, I think is powerful.
And there's a little bit of back and forth about that too between Joel Albizo and Larry Sloan. Joel said it's exceedingly difficult to identify potential, which can be more valuable than skills that have already been demonstrated and could help you lead you to more diverse choices.
So in the front mirror instead of or in the front windshield instead of the rear view mirror. That's a very good point, Joel. You can ask them questions to identify what they've done and how that fits in. But I guess it does come back to aligning your strategies, your strategic objectives of the organization, and their vision for how the organization could achieve them. And so spending time on unpacking your strategies, and hopefully you've got your strategic plan or key strategies identified through this process so the applicants know what your strategies are. And how, I think asking those pertinent questions in the call form, give us your wisdom on how you would see this meeting be. Good questions, Joe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a few more. Mary Shorman, I'm not sure on the pronunciation, she asked if there was any research into stipends being offered to board members, and then whether that was a motivating factor.
Well, certainly we know in the for-profit community, stipends are, board honorary or fees are one thing. And we do find that in particular the medical associations where there are stipends that are paid. So great question, but no, we did not research the amount or the impact of them. If I remember right, I think that Beth did address some of that in high-performing boards, but I can't remember to what extent. She's very available, too, if you want to reach out to her and ask her that question. I think that'd be a great idea, Mary, or if I can help with that, too. But this research really didn't unpack that. Good question. Okay. And it is a very small minority, I think, that would have stipends.
Kirsten Peterson is wondering if within the application form, are we seeing organizations ask those demographic questions, like age, ethnicity, etc.?
Great question. I think we'd have to look at some of the samples, to be honest with you. That's a great question. I think we also have to be cognizant of legal counsel, their opinion on that as well. And I think our AMS systems are trying to uncover that, with different questions. How formal that is in this process is a good question. But I think if we're saying we are looking for this type of a balance and representation, whether again it's geographic, geopolitical, or ethnicity, or what have you, the more we can let them know that we really do want to populate our board with this balance. So hopefully we'd have a mechanism to be able to allow that to happen.
Okay.
Good question.
Kirsten was also wondering about with the matrix tool. They use a similar one to what you showed.
Love to see it.
She said, would you have the candidate also do the exercise? For example, our board gets a questionnaire to rate themselves, low, medium, high, for various skills and competencies.
Yes.
And then they take that information and use it for the discussion when they prioritize.
Yeah, so the answer to that one is yes. So and I've got that evaluation matrix up here. So asking the current board to do that and asking applicants, we did see at least one of the high-performing boards, organizations that did that, saying, here's the competencies, rank yourself instead of necessarily rate yourself, which is a very interesting mechanism when you think about it, ranking versus rating. So, good question.
Okay. Keith Skillman is wondering, when you talk about the perception of the process, if that was based on all the organizations in the study. And if it was there a difference? Did you see a difference between among high-performing boards?
Well, the perception, the evaluation mechanism is against the board source. So how the CEOs perceive their board member performance and full board performance were the evaluation mechanisms. So repeat that question again.
He said...
Keith, you're getting technical on me.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Let's see. Assuming... is it based on all the organizations in the study?
Yeah.
Assuming so, did you see a difference in perceptions among the high-performing boards?
Yeah. So, I wish Will were on here, and we'll have to unpack that a little bit more with him. But the perceptions that, or the ratings of the board, it does get down to, looking for my slide here. The ones that were most impacted, the most validated through the research, were about the competencies, spending time unpacking the competencies and skills and desired traits of the board members, and then executive staff input on the candidates. So the regression results indicated substantially those two were the key factors that impacted that. So hopefully that's an answer. For more detail, we're going to have to get with the regression analysis.
Yeah.
The quant geek. Sorry, Will.
Larry Sloan again was wondering if the data are broken down from professional societies versus trade associations.
Yes.
Almost most of it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we do have access to that, Larry,
And Wendy is asking when the samples will be available.
Oh, good. So, so we're gonna have this call next week, and I think we'll have a better understanding of what the format looks like and how long it's gonna take to produce that. The samples are pretty much, we've been through them, they're ready to roll, but it's just a matter of what are we gonna do with the stuff that we got here, and what's it gonna look like in distributing the knowledge that we've created through this process. So I wish I could give you more definitive, but stay tuned.
Kristen was wondering how.
We're at the end.
We're at 11.
Question?
We can stay for anyone who's able to stay online.
Can we order lunch?
Wait, no. Well,
Okay.
You can order lunch.
Okay. All right, so we'll do this question, then we'll continue on for a few minutes.
Yeah, and those that have to drop off.
Yep. Thank you all for participating, though, and any information and samples you want to share, we would welcome to review them. So, good.
Kirsten Peterson is wondering how many international organizations study. And did they speak to the global challenges?
So the global challenges did come through in a couple of the case studies. We do have the data. I can tell you, and it was a pretty, it also depends on how you define professional. We know that's a little bit of an issue for us, but the 29% of the group said that they were international, and 34% said national. So it was about not quite a third that would qualify as international in their eyes. And I don't remember how we asked that question, to be honest with you. It might have been international membership or international leadership or international issues. I don't know which. We do know that, but I don't know off the top of my head.
I have one more here that's a little different from the others that have been asked, from Wendy Jo Toyama, asking us, how do you overcome the perception that there's an insider group selecting their friends with a recruitment process?
Excellent question, Wendy Jo. Well, so it gets back to that nasty case that we had about transparency. It was the good old boys going, members didn't even know who was on the nominating committee, which was ironic. I mean, how could that happen? But that did happen. So the cloak and dagger system was just unbelievable. And as you can imagine, the confidence and the trust in that leadership was just appalling because of the fact no one trusted each other. They didn't know how they even got into leadership, if you will. So that's why we started saying we need to create this bubble diagram, the process diagram that shows what are the steps, and that there is methodology to this instead of mystery. Mm-hmm. And so, and by the way, not surprisingly, Wendy Jo, but when we went back to that organization, the chair of that activity said, "We're going to change it over my dead body." And my answer was, well, that could be plan B since you're getting up there in age. Unbelievable. Sorry.
Okay.
We should erase that from the tape.
Yeah, maybe we'll do that. Okay. Most of the rest of these are comments that we can read later, but not questions exactly. So
Perfect.
It's time to wrap it up, Mark.
Well, thank you all so much, and I appreciate you helping us with this research and participating. Excited to get it on the streets. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you all.